And I've come to the 18th Prime Minister. You guessed him, his name correctly, Martin Brian Mulroney, who is known as Brian Mulroney. He was the only late 20th Canadian Prime Minister at the federal level to achieve two consecutive majority governments. On the other hand, his fall from political grace and favor was drastic. In the second half of his second term, so roughly in the years 1990 to 1993, he became very unpopular. That his support, at worst, ironically around the time when his good friend, US President um, George Bush, was basking in the afterglow of his victory in the first Persian Gulf War, was down to single digits. And even by the time he announced his retirement in late February 1993, his popularity had recovered only to a lackluster 21%. And then when he finally left office in late June 1993, his successor, Kim Campbell, despite her brief popularity known as Campbell Mania, was able to do rather little to prevent that electoral disaster, although she also had her campaign management issues and campaign style issues. Uh, Brian Mulroney was born in Baie-Comeau in eastern Quebec, an isolated and small town. His father, Ben, worked hard overtime because he wanted his son to have the chance to go to university, which Brian Mulroney did. And after passing the Quebec bar exam on his third try, he then started to practice law. Already in his teenage years in the 1950s, he had become a progressive conservative, and he idolized Prime Minister John Diefenbaker. However, as the 1960s wore on, and he saw Diefenbaker first become a minority prime minister in 1962 and then lose power in 1963, his enthusiasm for Diefenbaker started to wane. And then in 1966, behind the scenes, he supported the efforts of Dalton Camp, the president or chairperson of the Progressive Conservatives, to remove Diefenbaker from office, and eventually Camp's supporters managed to do that, even though Camp himself did not become the leader, but Robert Stanfield, the longtime premier of Nova Scotia, did. And so in 1967, Diefenbaker's term, 11-year turbulent term as the federal leader of Progressive Conservatives, came to an end. Mulroney had only taken part in a few student elections at Dalhousie University, if I remember correctly. He decided not to pursue a career in electoral politics yet, not even at the municipal level. Of course, he would have had a distinct disadvantage in Quebec, including Montreal, as a progressive conservative. Also at the provincial level, of course. If he had crossed the western border to Ontario, his prospects would immediately have improved, because Ontario had that unbroken period of 42 years from 1943 to 1985 of the progressive conservative provincial governments, and the party became known as the Big Blue Machine because its party color is blue. And even as we are living the last week, the last few days of 2018, we should remember that the progressive conservatives are in power in Ontario under Doug Ford. And then Brian Mulroney received favorable publicity starting in 1974 as a member of the so-called Clich Commission that was investigating corruption in Quebec's labor sector, and then the inquiry eventually reached the point where potentially criminal links between the Quebec provincial government, which back then was headed by the Liberal Premier Robert Bourassa, were considered. However, Mulroney, who wanted to remain or to be on good terms with Bourassa, did not proceed to the level of investigating whether Bourassa had authorized that corruption. Then he spent most of 1975 shoring up support for his campaign as a candidate for the Progressive Conservative leadership. Already after the July 1974 federal parliamentary elections, where the Liberals had achieved another majority, not as big one as in 1968 at the start of Trudeau's prime ministerial term, but nevertheless a workable one. And the Conservatives, Progressive Conservatives, after having come so close to toppling Trudeau, or at least to becoming the biggest party in 1972, faced another term on the opposition benches. Contrary to his predecessor, Diefenbaker, Stanfield had no desire to cling to power election after election after having failed to win power, and already then notified the country that he would be stepping down as the Progressive Conservative leader. However, the party was in no hurry to choose his successor. It took the party another year, until the summer of 1975 or so, to decide that the leadership convention would be held in late February 1976 in Ottawa. Heading into that winter convention, Mulroney had several strengths and several handicaps. His strengths were his looks, his deep and sonorous voice, his rhetorical abilities, his role, favorable publicity accumulated during his time as a member of the Clich Commission, then his graceful bilingualism, although as historian Kenneth MacNaught noted in his History of Canada, this was by no means unique to Mulroney. In Quebec, many people of Irish origin could be French by adoption. And then, well, his money. Although that was also one of his weaknesses, he spent by far the largest sum of money out of the 11 candidates who actually participated in the leadership election. One candidate, professor or some other university official, Whittington, withdrew from the election before the votes were cast and endorsed the frontrunner Claude Wagner of Quebec. Ironically, Mulroney had been one of the Progressive Conservatives who had been thrilled by a probably flawed opinion poll, anyway a misinterpreted one, done by Bob Teeter, who was a Republican pollster in the United States and a Progressive Conservative one in Canada, which had selected several Quebec-born politicians and had then asked a sampling of Quebec voters who among these politicians they think would defend Quebec's interests the most in Ottawa at the federal government level, and only Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau had defeated Claude Wagner, who had come second, a close second. However, the poll did not ask how many of these voters would support Claude Wagner should he switch parties and become a Progressive Conservative. Wagner had served in the Liberal government of, if I remember correctly, of Jean Lesage in the 1960s, then had been a tough anti-crime judge. In 1970, he had been a candidate for the Quebec Liberal Party's leadership, but had lost to Robert Bourassa. and he had then decided to leave politics temporarily, as it turned out, and return to the secure and well-paid position of a judge. However, in 1972, buoyed by this poll, which they had probably exaggerated the importance of, Mulrooney and certain other fellow progressive conservatives had decided to try to recruit Wagner into the party. Wagner had conditionally agreed. The condition was that he be given a financial security in a trust fund, because he would be leaving the secure and well-paid position of a judge in favor of that much less secure position of a politician, especially becoming a candidate of a political party that had for decades been, aside from some federal elections, profoundly unpopular in Quebec, because it was seen basically as the party of Anglo or English Canadians. Well, to put a long story short, at the start of September 1972, Prime Minister Trudeau announced that the new federal elections would take place at the end of October 1972. Some days later, Wagner announced that he would resign as a judge and would become a progressive conservative candidate in his electoral district or riding of Saint-Hyacinthe. He won the candidacy. He campaigned in the Gaspé Peninsula. According to a biographer of Mulrooney, Canadian writer John Sawatsky, Wagner talked only about law and order. In other words, the need to punish criminals with strict sentences and to enforce the laws in a major way, even though that was not a big issue in 1972. The turmoil of the 1960s had touched Canada, and the anti-war student and civil rights movements had basically lost much of their steam already. Anyway, as October 1972 wore on, it became clear that the progressive conservative campaign in Quebec was in a deep trouble, and finally, around the middle or then the late or the second half of October 1972, Wagner panicked. He abandoned his campaign bus in the Gaspé and flew home to Saint-Hyacinthe, where he then fought hard to win that seat, focusing once again on law and order. He managed narrowly to win that seat. The only other progressive conservative candidate who was elected in Quebec was the centre-left progressive conservative or red Tory Heward Grafty, who, according to Mr. Sawatsky, detested Wagner, and the dislike was reciprocated. So this so-called star candidate had been able to accomplish virtually nothing to improve the progressive conservative fortunes in Quebec. However, he had, among the Quebec progressive conservatives, especially those who were right-wingers, a following, and he was able to lock up the delegate selection convention in Quebec, so that Mulrooney, who had hoped to be nominated as an at-large delegate representing all of Quebec in the leadership convention of February 1976, did not manage to be chosen as a delegate, although of course as a candidate for the leadership he was allowed to attend the convention and speak there. Too late he found out that he should have sought a delegate's position and election as a delegate in his home electoral district. And this added fuel to the fire of his anger, even hatred of Claude Wagner. Still, Wagner came to the convention as a frontrunner because he had achieved a large majority of the Quebec delegates, while in the other provinces of Canada, the delegates were quite evenly divided between the major candidates. Also on the party's right wing were businessman Sinclair Stevens of Ontario, probably Toronto, Jack Horner of Alberta, who many people saw as some kind of a successor of John Diefenbaker, or potential successor anyway, and supporter of Diefenbaker. Then Patrick Nolan of Nova Scotia, who however was considered a minor candidate. And then the centrist or red Tory candidates were, and then there was another one, Paul Hellyer of Ontario, who ironically was a former Liberal, and not only that, he had even served briefly in the first federal cabinet of Pierre Trudeau. After falling out of favor with Trudeau or having major policy disagreements, he had left the Liberal Party, had then briefly established the Action Canada movement, which had proved unsuccessful, and then had decided to switch parties and join the Progressive Conservatives. It was ironical that a former Liberal cabinet minister had then become a right-wing Progressive Conservative, at least in his rhetoric. Anyway, the centrist or red Tory candidates were numerous. In addition to Mulroney, they included Joe Clark of Alberta, Flora MacDonald of Ontario, Hewart Grafty of Quebec, John O'Neill Fraser of British Columbia, possibly James Gillies as well. So what happened in the convention, to put a long story short, was that on the first ballot things looked quite promising for Mulroney, because he came second and he led all the moderate candidates. Wagner was first, but with under 1/4 of the votes. So between the first and second ballots, things started to switch favorably for Clark. James Gillies, Hewart Grafty, and surprisingly enough, Sinclair Stevens withdrew and supported him. Mulroney did not get any endorsements. And then after the second ballot, where Clark, having doubled his support, had placed a strong second after Wagner, although Mulroney had also managed to gain over 60 votes compared to the first ballot. After the second ballot, the following candidates decided to drop out. Fraser dropped out or was forced to drop out. He endorsed Clark. MacDonald decided to drop out and endorsed Clark. Then Horner, Hellyer, who had lost about half of his support from the first to the second ballot, and Nolan all dropped out and endorsed Wagner. On the third ballot, Wagner was only 34 votes ahead of Clark, with Mulroney a distant third. Mulroney was forced out of the election as the least supported candidate. He refused to endorse either Clark or Mulroney, but he kept repeating when reporters, journalists kept pestering him as to his preference out of the two remaining candidates, that he had no vote to cast. This was a subtle reminder of the fact that the Wagner loyalists had locked him out as an at-large delegate, although it was his own fault not to find out that this would happen and not to register as a candidate for his own electoral district on time. So Clark managed to defeat Wagner narrowly by a vote of 1,187 to 1,122. Enough of Mulroney's loyalists decided to hold their noses and to vote for Clark as the lesser of two evils. For some years afterwards, Mulroney remained bitterly opposed to Clark and badmouthed him privately. In the spring of 1978, he gave an interview to a Canadian journalist when it was expected that Prime Minister Trudeau, who was, for all his economic and other problems, still clearly more popular than Clark, would take advantage of that popularity and call an election for that summer or autumn. However, Trudeau decided to postpone the election call to 1979, which gave Clark more time to recover his popularity. Anyway, in that interview that was supposed to be a pre-election interview, Mulroney basically said that he just couldn't see how Clark could win the upcoming federal parliamentary elections because the progressive conservatives were so weak in Quebec. And he subtly let it be known that should Clark stumble, should Clark fail as the progressive conservative leader, he could replace him. However, Mulroney did fund the progressive conservatives' election campaigns in 1979 and in 1980. Then during 1982, he worked behind the scenes to bring Clark down. One of his Quebec supporters, Rodrigue Pajot, claimed to be in favor of Clark, but was in fact a double agent. Pajot would died of cancer shortly after Mulroney became prime minister in September 1984. Anyway, in the Progressive Conservative Party convention that was held in Winnipeg in January 1983, only 66.9% of the voting delegates who participated in that vote openly supported Clark and opposed a leadership review. Clark decided to resign his position and at the same time run for re-election. And in June 1983, Mulroney managed to defeat Clark on the fourth ballot with 1,584 votes to 1,325. Contrary to Mulroney in 1976 and for some years afterwards, Clark proved to be a good loser. He graciously accepted defeat and he loyally supported Mulroney, and then for 7 years under Mulroney he served as the Secretary of State for External Affairs or Foreign Minister, and then as Constitutional Affairs Minister and so forth. Brian Mulroney was able to defeat the Liberals led by the new Prime Minister John Turner in a landslide victory on September the 4th, 1984, receiving about 50%, the Progressive Conservatives receiving about 50% of the vote and almost 3/4 of the seats. Only Diefenbaker in 1958 had been able to achieve a higher percentage both of the popular vote and of the seats. Back in that time, the House of Commons only had 265 members. Diefenbaker got 208 of them, while in 1984 Mulroney got 211 seats out of 282. Mulroney wanted in a major way to reform Canada's society and economy, to stimulate the economy, and the unemployment rate did start coming down from about 11%. However, the Canadian Senate was still heavily liberal because of the long succession of liberal governments and prime ministers, and therefore in many cases Mulroney had to water down his reform bills or legislative proposals to have them passed by the Senate. And then there were, during the first 2 or 3 years of Mulroney's first term as the Prime Minister, some ministerial scandals and resignations. And while Mulroney had so glowingly and angrily attacked Turner for what he called an avowal of failure and an admission of non-leadership in the English language televised debate of late July 1984, and largely by that digital attack against and rhetorical attack against Turner had convinced many undecided Canadian voters to support the Progressive Conservatives instead of the Liberals. Once in office, despite appointing several or many prominent members of other political parties such as Liberals, New Democrats, and the Quebec Liberals. He nevertheless appointed mostly fellow progressive conservatives and or conservative sympathizers. In other words, the patronage appointments, despite his partial pledges to at least radically reduce them, did not disappear. Then he decided to sign that free trade agreement with the United States before the 1988 federal election campaign. And basically, John Turner, as the official opposition leader, turned the election campaign into a referendum on free trade, claiming that Mulroney had, with one stroke of a pen, sold Canadians out to the United States. He claimed that the free exchange of goods and services would sooner or later radically reduce Canada's political independence of the United States. And he also kept Mulroney on the defensive by aggressively attacking him and his policies, especially free trade, throughout the French language and the English language debates, televised debates in late October 1988. Briefly, the Liberal popularity soared from being the third most popular political party to being the most popular one, but then Mulroney ordered his campaign team to start attacking the, especially the Liberals, and start claiming that Turner had no positive alternative to Mulroney's economic policies, including free trade,